So it's hour 2. We've got our add working now in our game library. So it adds. I've added a bunch of junk data here. So our next step is to get delete working. Added a click handler with Angular on our add button. We're going to want to do the same thing on our delete button. So we'll go back to our form. Now, when we did this before with EJS, we wrote a little JavaScript that popped up a confirmation. We won't use that here for jQuery. What we're going to do is in our component, this clicking the button will call our delete, and we can write our little confirmation in our component and check whether the user clicks OK or cancel. So on our delete button, again in round brackets, on click, we will say delete game. But in this case, we need to pass in the game.id. Right? If we're going to delete something, we need the primary key value so we know what document to delete. So we'll pass in here game._id. With add, we didn't need to pass that in, but with delete, we do. So again, we're going to write 3 delete methods, one in the component, one in the service, one in the API. So this is going to call the delete game method we want to write in our Angular component. So we'll write a delete method with the same signature, so we're accepting an ID parameter. First thing we'll do is let's show a confirmation, make sure that works. So we'll just say if confirm. For the moment, we'll just leave it at that. We won't do anything. We just want to make sure when we click the delete button, we get the confirmation box popping up. If this does not equal true, well, we don't do anything. We just stop, right? So if I try and click delete, that's good. We get the message. When I click cancel, nothing happens. If I click OK, well, nothing happens yet. That's fine. So we can write regular JavaScript inside of our TypeScript files if we want. So if the user does confirm in our game service, we're going to call delete game. And again, we'll pass in the ID. And after we delete, we probably want to call right. Let's call our get method to refresh the list. If the user clicks OK to our confirmation, call delete game, pass the ID, and then when that's done, refresh, so that game will disappear. So now we need to write this method in our service, and then we'll have a method in our API that removes it from MongoDB. And yes, WebStorm is saying delete game does not exist yet in the service. Well, that's next. We don't need any headers here because we're not sending in a post request with a whole object. All we're sending in is a single value. Which HTTP method should we call in this case? Chad? Yeah, let's call delete. When we did this before, we used the get, but here we're actually invoking delete. At API slash, and then we're going to append on the ID that we get from our component. We don't need the headers that we used when adding. We're not sending a full JSON object. So we're going to make a delete request at /API/ and we're appending on the ID as a parameter. So now we'll need a router.delete in our express controller. That'll just take the ID, call game.remove, pass in the ID. So now our component error is gone because delete now exists in our service. So we'll need to now modify our API and write a delete handler here. Our ID will be prefixed with a colon because it's a parameter. It's not a hard-coded URL, it's a value passed in. The ID we're passing to Mongoose is our ID parameter from our request, from our delete request. That should handle the deletion and just our callback. Now, somebody asked a good question this morning. Why are we getting a game back if we're calling delete? What will actually come back if we successfully remove the game? We can't get a game back with properties because we just got rid of it. So what will actually be in here? If we inspected the value of game after deleting something. Yeah, it'll just be an empty JSON object. So we're either getting back an error or just an empty object. So we could even leave that parameter out if we wanted to, really. We'll just do our usual error handling. If we don't get an error, we'll just send back an empty JSON object with status 200. Okay. So our APIs really become super lightweight. Really just take some data in and issues calls to Mongoose. That's it. We could stick any kind of front end onto this. So we should be able to actually try our delete now. We'll say cancel, nothing happens. If we delete, okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. So let's figure out why. When we clicked, we called delete game in our component and passed in the ID. Our delete game, look in the ID. This looks okay. We have an ID parameter. Let me think for a moment. Oh, I think because let's see, open. Open and close. Oh, I think I've got a bracket problem here. Map. Maybe not. I'll have to check our console for an error. Not found. Localhost. That's interesting. So it's a URL problem somehow. Let's check carefully. I see the problem. Anybody else see the problem? Problem is in here. Issue with the URLs. Why does post work and delete throw 404? Right. Our API is already pointed in app.js here. Notice in our other methods, the root is just slash. So it would be the same here. Thank you, browser console. A good suggestion, ASAT. That should fix our problem. So now I should be able to delete. So the page doesn't refresh. That data gets updated. So it looks to the user like real time. Delete this one. Just disappears from the screen, which is the experience we want to create. So again, in my Express controller, We had API here. We don't need the word API anywhere in here. It's already mapped in app.js. Three-quarters of the way done. Again, here's our express controller we call game remove. Here's our service where we invoke the delete method. And here's our component. So delete, kind of like the get, doesn't require as much code as doing a post. So our last step is going to be to write we'll need two more functions, one for selecting the existing game and one for processing an update to it. Now the good thing is, from a performance point of view, when we click edit and we want to fill the form, we don't really need to make a query in the database again. So selecting the game should be simpler than that. How can we fill out the form by clicking an edit button without having to go to the database and select out that game? So when I click here, I want the game values to populate above. Yeah, we already have all the values of every game displayed. So we just need to set the title, developer, and genre and year property based on the selected game. We don't have to go to the database for this. We'll have to go to the database to save changes, but not to populate the form, because all the values we want to show, they're already here. So our select method is a little easier. We only need it in our component. We don't need a select method in the service. We don't need a select game method in the API. So on our edit button, on click, we're going to select a game, but rather than passing in the ID, we want to pass in the entire game. So that includes all of the properties. So we'll add a click directive, select that game, and pass in whichever game object, whatever row we're in. Because remember, we're using this ng4, so game represents all the properties of the current game while we're in a loop. So now we should be able to write a simple select game function in our component. So what will we do so we can populate the form? We need 4 lines of code, and it will get the game to show up in the form. So this is how, look at what we're doing for adding. How do we refer to, say, the title? If we want to set the title in the text box. This dot title equals, well, we're passing in the game object that was selected. We're going to need to use this object that got passed in. Yeah, game title. That's it. But now if we click an edit button, the title should get copied. Because remember, this is a two-way data binding with that ng model. So if we click any game, the title is bound now using ng model. So we just need to bind the other three properties in the same way, developer, genre, and year, and then clicking on any game will populate the form with all those values. There's no need to go and query the database for this information. We already have it on our page. So that should be all we need to do to select the current game. Actually, there is one more thing we're going to have to do. But this should fill out our form. Right? All the values change when I click on a different game. Now we also need a little bit of logic here in terms of our form. We don't want to keep this add button. What will happen if I click the add button? Akash, what'll happen? Yeah, that's designed to call add game. So if I go ahead and add this again, well, I've just added it. So what we want to have here is an update button. And when we click edit, we want the add button to hide and the update button to appear. After we update, the update button should go away, the add button should come back, and we want to clear out our form again. And we'll maybe want to put a reset button on here. We already have a function to clear the form, right? So we could put on a button that we'll call clear form if we want to clear it out. Let me just delete this. Oh, that's interesting. Why didn't that work? Maybe I didn't click it properly. So let's go back to our form and let's add another button. We'll make it exactly the same as our add button. Except it's going to call edit game, sorry, update game, and the text will say update. Looks something like this for now. Except we never want to see both of these buttons. We should only see one or the other. So when I do this, I want this button to appear, and it'll be here, and this button to disappear. So Angular gives us a way to write if statements in our user interface to determine what to do with elements. Now we're also going to need one other input here when we're saving. We've got the 4 inputs. What other value do we need if we're going to do an update? Yeah, we're going to need the ID as well. So for now, stick in an input down here called underscore ID, underscore ID. And let's set it up being bound as the ng model as underscore ID. So when we click on something, that box should get populated with an ID if we click edit. then we can write some logic that will show one button and hide the other one in a really efficient way. Angular is great for what we're going to do. Now we'll make this hidden in a minute. Now, what else we need to do, one thing here when we click edit, notice our text box is blank all the time. We want the ID to get filled in there. So what do we need to do to also populate this box? Where should we go to make that happen? And it's going to be with all the other code we're using when we click edit. Edit calls select game. So where do we find that method? Which file? Yeah, in our component. So right now, when we call select, we're filling these properties. So what other properties should we fill here? Yeah, let's also set this .id equals game .id. Now it should populate the text box with the ID as well when we go to edit something. Okay, so that's what we want. We'll hide this in a minute. We just need to get it working first. So our select game also needs to populate the ID. We should probably also, when we're clearing the form, if there's an ID, we should wipe it out. So up in clear form, let's also set the ID property to null. Otherwise, we're going to wind up editing the wrong document. Now, here's the fun part. Here's the Angular magic part. We scroll up with update. We're going to add this. ng if underscore ID, meaning if underscore ID has a value, this element is visible. When this value is null, this HTML element is hidden by Angular. So it's only visible when ID has a value. Let's see how this works. So when we load our form, right, ID is null, so update doesn't appear. As soon as I click something, update shows up. As soon as I get rid of that last character, it's gone. If I give it a value, it comes back. So this is great for designing a rich user interface, right? Because we can manipulate the DOM based on our data. Right? We could have all kinds of conditions, you know, if this is true, show the user this. For example, I built a site like this with Flash years and years ago. What it was, it's a company that builds sawmills. So a portable sawmill you can use if you want to build your own cabin. And there was so you would select what sawmill you wanted to buy and we'd show a picture of it. And then we'd show all the components, all the options. But if you picked certain options, it also meant you had to buy another option. If you bought this piece, it doesn't work unless you bought this. So it was a giant pain to write in Flash. It would have been so much easier in Angular because we could say, okay, the customer wants this option. Well, now we can add this image to it as well.
Can the when item appears or disappears from the page, can it be animated as well?
Could be. Sure. So you could do something like, yeah, absolutely. You could do that. So our add button, we want the opposite, right? Whenever the update button is visible, the add button should go away. So to do that, we'll use another ng if. And in this case, put in exclamation mark ID. So when we have no ID, or when the ID is null, the add button is visible. Conditions are opposite, we'll never see both buttons at the same time. We'll only see one and not the other. And if we play around with the values in the ID box, we can show or hide whichever button. It works like this. When our page loads, we have add and not update. Now add goes away. As soon as I wipe out that last character, update will disappear and add will come back. Now we can make our input hidden. As long as it's there and we're using it for our buttons to show or hide, doesn't really matter. The user doesn't need to see it. We just need it so if we do an update, we can include that ID value when we're updating so we know which document we're modifying. So let's go back into game, and in our input, we can make it hidden now. We don't want the users to actually type in there. So now it's good. My update button shows up as my form is filled out. Now, the only catch is if I want to go and add now, what do I have to do? Well, even if I clear it, I've got a problem because the ID is still going to be there, right? I can delete all these, but it's still, but now if I hit update, I will have wiped out all the values on this document. Yeah, so we probably want a reset button, and it can call that clear form function we already have, right? So that will also wipe out the ID. Right now, my only way to do it is to actually refresh the page. Then add comes back, but we should give the user a reset button. If we're doing a single page application where it isn't going to reload, we better make sure there's a reset on there. We'll add one more button. On click, we call our clear form method. We've already written this method. Because we're calling it after we're adding, we want our form values to get wiped out. So we've already written in our component, we've already got clear form that wipes out everything, including the ID. So we can, by writing it in its own, this is why I wrote it in its own function. We could have written this code in side of add, but I knew we would want to be able to just call it from a reset button. So now we can do this. Add will show up. So when we edit, if I choose reset, it's wiped out the ID, obviously, because add comes back, update goes away. Now, I had a student this morning say, couldn't we just use a save button that will do either add or update, depending? The answer is yes. I just find it's a little messy. Then in here, we need a save, and then we need to evaluate if we have an ID, do a put, or do an update. If we don't have an ID, do an add, which would be another way of doing it. You could do it that way if you wanted. Because this is our first time working with this, I wanted to cleanly separate add and update. Nothing wrong with that pattern if you prefer it. So maybe a little more efficient to code, but also a little harder to follow. And we're kind of new at this, me included. So our last piece, right now this will call an update method. Well, we don't have that method. So we need an update method in our component. We need an update method in our service, and then we need a method in the API. That method won't be get, won't be post, won't be delete. Anybody have an idea what method we're going to write in our API? Can actually get an idea here if we go to our service. If I type HTTP dot, here's our list of common HTTP methods. So we've used get, we've used post, we've used delete. Any idea? There's actually 2 of these here that are commonly used for doing updates. You want to guess? Chad, you can guess. Put is the common one. The other one that is used sometimes is patch. So both of those are typically used to process an update. So we can use either one. I'm going to use put because it's more common. So our interface here is done. We don't have to do anything else with our HTML view. It's already, our update button is already designed to call update game. We don't have to pass in any parameters because all of the values are bound with an RNG model. So we have all the values we need. So in our game component, we now need an update. So it's going to be pretty similar to our add, except we also need to include the ID. And in our service, we're going to call update game instead. So we'll create the game, including the ID. What should we do after? So our game service sends the update off to our API updates the database. Once that game is changed in MongoDB, what else should happen? What should the user see? So I make a change, I change some values and click update. We obviously want those changes saved in MongoDB. I would suggest there's 2 things that should happen in the front end. Yeah, so we should refresh that list. And what else should we refresh? Yeah, what should we do with the inputs? So after I'm done saving this, what should the form look like? Yeah, let's clear it. Well, we already have a clear method, so we'll call our clear form method and refresh the games list. So we'll call this dot get games and this dot clear form, because clear form wipes out all the form values. It also, including wiping out the ID, which then hides the update button and shows the add button again with our ng if. So we just need to write our update method in our service. We'll write our put method in our API, and we should be done. Doesn't really matter what order we do these in. If you want to clear the form first, refresh the HTML table second, no problem. So our game service will need this method that accepts in a game object. So our post will be at the same URL as our delete. But in this case, with delete, all we took in was an ID. Here we're taking in the whole object. So we need to prefix ID with game dot because it's getting the entire game as a parameter. Stringify the game. And we need to add the headers because we're making a request. We're submitting a whole request body. And again, so we can set the content type as JSON. Same as above with. So there's our service method. Except I put in post. We want it to be put. So we're not routing any post request at /API/ an ID number. Only put and delete at that URL. And now we just need a router.put in our Express controller that will do an update. So now my red line here goes away. And we'll go back to our API and do an update. So we'll use router.put, which we haven't done before. That's /:ID. We're going to update the game with this ID. We'll take the ID from the parameter. And then we just pass in the request body. All the fields are mapped to the name properties with the same name in Mongoose. I'll just copy this from delete. It's exactly the same. Same error handler or response. But keep in mind, we don't have in our backend, in our API, we don't have a get method to get a single game based on its ID. Because when we're selecting in our front end, we didn't need to. If we wanted to make that available in the API itself, we'd need another GET request. at this URL with an ID, and then we'd need to call game.findById or game.findOne. So if we needed that for our JSON API, that's fine. We don't need it for our Angular front end. Well, now we should be able to update things. I'll just add one. So I can add, and if I go to edit it, it should say update there. Ah, we found a little bug. I can update one of the other ones, but anybody have an idea why this happened? If I update one of the other ones, it says update. But if I pick this one, it's still saying add.
Because that ID you gave it was empty.
Here's why. One little logic flaw in our adding. Look what we do when we add. We add, and then I'm adding the new game to our games array. The problem is the new game object, this is what we're sending in, it doesn't have the ID. So maybe instead of adding it to the array, call get games. We need to requery the database so we can fetch the ID of the record we just added. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good point. The response itself is a game object. Good point. Okay, let's try it this way. Yes, that's more efficient than requerying the database. We'll try that. I guess I should also make sure my update actually works. Yeah. So update works. But if I add a new one and then immediately go to change it, we'll see whether we fixed it. So it shows up. It's underneath my footer, I think. I better delete one. I can't even click edit because there's no ID.
It's inputting in a blank ID when you're because of that bar, right?
Well, now I've managed to break it somehow. Let's see. See, now I can edit.
And it deleted the other one.
Not showing up, so I think we're on the right track here. It will get added, but it's not refreshing automatically. So it's adding them to my database, but my page is not refreshing. So it's not quite the response. And we don't have a game. Well, for lack of a better solution, I'll call get games and think that over. There's probably a more efficient way of doing it than running a query, but this will work properly for now, and I'll have to mull that over. Delete these. Now let's see if I can add. Oh. Okay, so I add, and the question is whether I can go and edit it now right away. Yeah, I can edit it right away because we're requerying, so our list includes the ID. So now I can edit. It works right away. Hey, Sad, I like the way you're thinking that it shouldn't be necessary to requery, and I'm sure there is a way to just add that object to our array that includes the ID, but I have to play with it a bit. So it does add quite a bit of extra work to inject Angular. I mean, we had this whole thing working without Angular, but you can see from a user interface perspective why we may want to go to the trouble to do the extra work to include Angular. Particularly if we're only working with one table of data or one collection, that we can let the user do everything on a single page without them having to go from one page to the other or reload stuff. So that was our complete solution. I'm going to put it up on GitHub. Are there any questions before I do?
I think the problem with that response is also returning underscore v, which is not mapping. We are not mapping anything, so maybe that's great. Console log the response, you can see that it's returning underscore v.
Okay. It's odd because our API does return the game in JSON, so we should have it.
We have an extra column.
We have an extra column?
If you go to mlab and look at the object itself, there's one thing that added to.
That's probably a good idea to have a look. Well, I deleted it, so I better add it back in.
I think that's causing the problem because it's not mapping properly. It's when we're returning it.
Right, that would make sense to add it to the array when the format doesn't match. Well,
Object right in there.
mind you, our games array says any. It's not typed, so it shouldn't necessarily care because there's no definition of that array. It should allow anything to be added to it. I'll have to think that over. I'm sure there's a more efficient way than the way I'm doing it. Let me just see here.
Oh,
You kind of risk. What if I try?
Yeah, how to think about that. I'm going to put up the files.